Welcome again to Tarot for Anti-Racism. As I mentioned, um, I am doing a lot more anti-racism work on my own. I am currently reading Me and White Supremacy by Layla F. Saad and doing the journal prompts through that book. And I'm trying to take more of a role in the company I work for to participate in conversations within the company about what the company can be doing, and trying to contribute in additional ways that I might have typically held back from. I'm donating a lot more money than I used to, and I've always been pretty progressive on this topic, but I'm certainly finding that I have more work to do, and I'm coming to new and more kind of radical seeming conclusions. Like, whereas defund the police made me kind of like wince initially, I'm now fully on board with that concept. And this is a part of my growth. And I do think that I do hope and encourage everyone to be following as many people, as many Black leaders, educators, activists out there who are doing and have been doing for a long time the education work of anti-racism. They are the leaders, and we are grateful for their work. So again, I don't know. I want to say that I've seen a lot of comments and statements on Instagram and in other places about white people like me trying to offer sessions around anti-racism. And so I felt a little self-conscious, and I've second-guessed myself around even offering this. But as I said a minute ago, I think that one unique thing that I can bring to this is my understanding of tarot and my love for tarot. Tarot has been something that I've been able to use to understand a lot of human dynamics that are very complicated and very fraught. Things like addiction, codependency, narcissism, all the different ways we can flourish and undermine ourselves and those around us. And so I think it's equally, or to some extent, useful in terms of understanding this, the problem of white supremacy and the work of anti-racism. So that's why I offer this, and I'm glad that you all have joined me, and I hope to offer you something of value here. And I know you're bringing your own experience and wisdom to this, so I welcome that, and please chime in the chat with anything you want to add as we go forward. So just to start off, I created this as like a little context, and I'm going to kind of take you through the timeline I see that the collective has moved through in the recent past. So since like February or March, just to kind of situate us where we are. This is reductive and simplified, and it's describing a condition and a climate that is very complicated and very nuanced. But I think it's just kind of helpful to review. So we start kind of before the pandemic with this Emperor card. And this is actually the year of the Emperor because it's 2020. And if you take that in a numerological sense, 2 and 2 is 4, and 4 is the number of the Emperor. So as this year started, other tarot like leaders or people I follow and learn from, they've talked about this idea of the year of the Emperor. And the Emperor is the archetype that represents organization and structure and sometimes hierarchy. It's the energy that keeps us out of anarchy because it creates systems, it creates some organization or structure for us to operate within. So, as long as humans have been living together and forming little societies and communities, they have their own rituals, they have their traditions, they have their ways of dealing with good behavior and bad behavior. And this year, certainly, I think, as time wears on, we're beginning to really have a confrontation with that Emperor energy. We're seeing a lot of the systems in our country, the great American ideal that is supposed to provide a peaceful and democratic existence for people. We're finding in so many different categories through the pandemic that that system is really failing and has been failing for a long time. So that's how, as the months go on, I'm really seeing this emperor concept play out in our consciousness. And then the pandemic hit. And this really sent everyone into this kind of moon phase. And the moon is about delving into the unconscious, the subconscious, the dreamscape, where things resemble our reality as we know it, but they've also been mixed and scrambled and remade and reconfigured. And so the pandemic, while it has many other impacts, certainly, it has also had this impact of, we realized suddenly that the lifestyle that we had been living, the way that we went about our days and our weeks and our months, kind of on autopilot, all of that is now up for question and reconfiguration. We can't participate in things the way we used to. And so whatever meaning we might have ascribed to our job or to the routines or the places we went or the little indulgences we gave ourselves, or just fundamental things like educating children, all of these things are suddenly like warped and blurry and really kind of in this strange soup that it's hard to make sense of. So that's given us quite a lot to contend with. And now that we've kind of had to shelter in place through this experience, we've all had to varying degrees of success, sit with ourselves and examine that lifestyle that we used to have before. So without some of the same distractions we've always had, places to go, people to meet, things to do, we just have a lot of time with ourselves to go inward and to think about what things really mean to us, what we value, what's important, what we might change if we really had nothing to lose. And that's what the hermit is about, is withdrawing from the world, connecting with inner wisdom. The hermit is really connected to wisdom that extends beyond our own lifetime. And whether we're trying to work with the hermit or not, he's probably working with all of us. And I should say that I'm using the Smith Rider-Waite deck for a lot of this presentation, and I'll be coupling this with cards from another deck so you can see the difference. This deck came out in 1910. It's been around for a really long time. It was created by white people, and it represents only white people, and this is a big problem with this deck. There's also been a lot written about this deck because it's been around for so long and because it proliferated so much, like in the 60s and 70s with when the baby boomers were young. And so it's easy to learn with, and every card in the deck has an image, almost every card, of humans, which helps us connect with a story in the card. So that makes this deck a little easier to learn with as well. When we're talking about like the white supremacy side of things, this deck sort of holds up because it really is reductive in its representation. But like I said, I'll be coupling that with another deck that is much more inclusive and much more modern. So just a side note, a footnote on that. So next up, we're going through a lot of grief as well, along with the hermit. So the death toll of this virus, the loss for children of their schools and the ability to see their friends or see grandma and grandpa, the loss of the people we used to see and hang out with and connect with just going into a workspace. So the griefs run large and they run small depending on things we're attached to. And so that's something that's kind of seeping into this hermit energy that we've been experiencing at the same time. And then we kind of come up to the present moment more recently with an encounter with the devil. And I feel like this is really a reckoning for the entire country and for other countries across the globe who are paying attention. But this is a little lead up to like how changes in the world have kind of been preparing us to confront this problem, hopefully in a much deeper and more meaningful way than we ever have before. So the devil is the card that I most closely assign to the, what to call it, white supremacy is a reality. It is also an illusion. But we live in a society that governs itself through this illusory premise of white supremacy. When I most deeply understood the devil before this time, it had a lot to do with addiction. And you can see in this card that there are two people chained to the block of the devil. The devil sits above them, lording over them. He has the torch held to the ground. The two people standing there are kind of like, they don't look to be in that much pain, even though looking at this card, you would never personally consciously choose to place yourself in the environment of this card, right? It looks menacing, it looks unpleasant. Yes, as someone's saying, it reminds me of our addiction to fossil fuels. Yeah, we just go with it. So the two people are standing there. I've said, like, it's almost like they could be just standing by the water cooler at work, like talking about their favorite Netflix show and not realizing that they're participating in something that may be actually quite harmful to them and the people around them. So with addiction, for example, an addict will engage in this self-destructive behavior again and again because they're under the illusion that this is the only way that they can live. The devil has like receded into the background, even though they remain chained to that devil. They've lost all kind of imagination for something else, and they've lost awareness of their own agency to change and direct their lives. They've given over their power to this devil, and they've forgotten that they've done it, and they've forgotten that they actually have power that they can utilize. So white supremacy, I think, functions in much the same way. It pervades every part of our social system, our cultural system. It is everywhere that we look. It's in our healthcare system, our education system. It's in our government, local, federal, state. It's all over the place. It's in our families as well. And I think right now, a lot of us those of us who benefit and have for a long time from white privilege are beginning to wake up to the fact that we have been complicit in the maintenance of the devil's illusion by kind of just going about our business and living our lives and being a bit oblivious. We continue to let the devil do exactly what he does. So he's the card to kind of set this stage for us. This is the adversary, or this is the energy we're really reckoning with at this time. And then I wanted to offer the world as an antidote to the devil. So whereas in the devil card, you have this disproportionate distribution of power. All the power has been given over to this energy with bad intentions, with this energy that like only consumes and does not give. The world is a more integrated card where power is like the individual, rather than being chained to the devil. The individual is free. They are floating in space. They are encompassed in this wreath of unity, and they're surrounded by 4 signs from the 4 cardinal signs of the zodiac, each one representing a different element: earth, air, fire, and water. And so this is the card of liberation. It's the card of enlightenment. It's the card of wholeness and unity. The card of, having healed oneself and being able to carry that healed self into the world to make more good. So I've taken these 2 cards as like bookends that I'm going to, that I placed in a larger kind of tarot spread that I created. So I'll show you that. Oh, let me first show you this. So here you can see these two of the same cards from a different deck. This is the Next World tarot deck. And like I said, it's much more modern, much more inclusive, much more representative in terms of racial identity, but also gender fluidity and gender identity, sexuality. And here the world is shown. You also see those four elements surrounding the figure in the middle. We no longer have a white person shown in the middle of a card, but we also see, I should go back, I don't know if I can, but in the world card of the Smith Rider-Waite deck, the figure is androgynous, or is said to be androgynous, even though you do see some female attributes, and I think this is shown in this card as well, a little bit of androgyny and gender play. But with the devil in particular, if you zoom in on this card, it's not letting me go forward. Sorry, guys. Okay, here we go. If you zoom in on this card, I didn't even realize this until a couple weeks ago, that there's actually like racist business happening in the midst of the card. You see a figure in the Klan outfit, doing business with someone who could like really theoretically be Donald Trump without his hairpiece, and this mass of pale, ghostly people sort of looking on passively while these American eagles fly overhead and bombs are dropping, and you can see the dollar sign and the shark's mouth. And this, I think, really exemplifies what I'm talking about. When you take the devil into a modern collective context, it really is about all of those illusions that are at work behind the scenes in the systems that we participate in all the time. Okay, so we have them here again, and I've taken them out and I've broken them apart and then infused this roadmap with more cards in the middle. So the idea is to kind of like, and obviously this whole, there are, more than 400 years of history behind this problem in America, and a tarot reading is not going to address it fully by any stretch of the imagination. But here are a few different lenses through which we can look at this problem in the current moment. And so on the top line, I have 4 cards that describe some of the things that feed into the upholding of white supremacy, the maintenance of it. In the middle line, we have the shift that I feel like is taking place, and that has a lot to do not only with the work that has been done over hundreds of years by activists and civil rights leaders and freedom fighters, but also the kind of cosmic winds that are blowing through our lives at this moment. And then the bottom line represents or includes several cards that I think can help us think about the work that will be important for us to undertake individually with our particular strengths and talents to help us all achieve the world card that we see at the end. I don't know, I'm cynical at the same time, and I hope there is a day when that healing comes. And whether it comes in my lifetime or not, I understand that I have to do more to contribute to the promise of that. So we'll dive in a little bit on these this first line of cards. Maybe I should pause for a second and see if anyone has a question or comment in the chat real quick. Is this making sense? Anything I can address? All right. So, and you can drop into the chat anytime. Starting with the 3 of Swords, and we have 3 Swords cards in this first line, which is interesting. The swords, are connected with the air element, and they're connected with the realm of human thought, the mind, the intellect, what happens in our brains. And the 3 of Swords is a really emotional card, even for, it's like the one very emotional card we see in the Swords. I don't know, that's not true. It's one of the more emotional cards we see in the Swords progression, and that use of the heart in the middle, of course, evokes that very strongly. So this is a card of, as you can see, like it's raining, three swords piercing a heart. It's gray behind that heart. It's a very sad card. It looks a little bit like grief and loss and heartbreak. And I've talked about it for a long time as a card of like an old wound that needs attention and needs more healing. And this is particularly true in this context because even as so much work has been done by civil rights leaders, by freedom fighters, by activists of many stripes to combat white supremacy, there's never been a real, true, earnest undertaking to try and heal the wound that slavery and white supremacy have created in our society. That is America's original sin. Like so much of what this country is built on is either the colonization of land that was inhabited by other people and the making into a capitalist economy on top of that land using the labor of people who were taken from their lands 400 years ago. And that's something I'm sure, people have acknowledged here and there, but in South Africa, for example, with, mixed success, that country has undertaken a real truth and reconciliation initiative. But the United States has never once really approached that idea. So this wound remains open. When I talk about the Three of Swords, I talk about that wound not getting the healing attention it needed, and it has now migrated into the space of the mind where it governs our thoughts and our psyche. So because that wound has never been addressed, never been acknowledged fully, it continues to persist in the psyche of this country. So that's something really important to note. And then we have the Five of Swords, which shows one gentleman holding three swords. Two are fallen to the ground. There's two figures in the back who have turned their backs and walked away. And the clouds in the sky are kind of, they look like they've been torn or ripped. There's a lot of like sharpness and deceit in this card. And in a general context, I talk about this card as having shown up for a project, a scenario, a situation where you think you're doing business or meeting the other person, the other people on whatever playing field that you believe is right. And over the course of time, you realize that the game is somewhat rigged. Like the rules that you had in mind are not actually the ones that other people are governing themselves by. And I think this is something that's certainly happened on a systemic level where in communities of color, they are under-resourced so that those resources are allocated more to the wealthy. That happens in healthcare, that happens in education. There's something that's been taken from those communities and leaving them with far less than they deserve for the benefit of someone else with no real basis in logic or morality or anything else. This also happens on a much more micro level. And one thing that has been really helpful for me, not just in the last 3 months, but over a period of a couple of 5 years, I don't know, but is the way that more and more people are talking about things like microaggressions and the way that subtle acts of racism take place in the workplace or in any kind of like recreational space or all kinds of spaces where, something, even speaking up for yourself or calling something out can result in some kind of backlash, making you feel like it's almost not even worth it to say something. And this is an ongoing struggle and one that only reinforces the wound. Each act of this is another persistence of that wound that we see in the Three of Swords. And so the awareness that's growing around what those subtleties look like and how we participate in them, how we white people participate in them, that's becoming increasingly important. Our third card is the Eight of Swords, and this is another one that I did a little video about, and it really spoke to me as I was reading more about white fragility and white silence in particular. And so I really, like, this stood out. I was like, oh, I'm looking in a mirror right here. Like I said, I felt like on the right side of this cause for a long time, but yet I was doing very little. And I was like, told myself, I guess it was sufficient to simply believe what I believed and to align with like the right side in all of this. And but without action and without taking any forward movement or doing something with those beliefs, I basically leave myself in this Eight of Swords kind of situation. So in the same way we see that, like in the Five of Swords, there's some kind of retribution or this rigged game in terms of talking about this subject or being truthful about it, or, you know, calling it for the way it truly is, the idea that something will be stolen or taken away. I think that same notion persists really for everyone who inhabits this white supremacist world. So I've sat back on different occasions because I was afraid it would compromise my status or my security, or that I might be the one who was given the Five of Swords kind of situation just for speaking the truth. And so I opted to kind of play this sort of helpless role. And with the Eight of Swords, you can see she's bound, you can see she's blindfolded, she's partially surrounded by swords, but there's no one there to really harm her. Her sense of smallness and her enclosure is partly in her mind. She believes that she's helpless, she believes that she can't do something, she believes that she must remain blind to the rest of like what's out there. But if she did struggle and if she did exert herself and fight a little bit, she would come free of those bindings. She would realize she's surrounded by swords that she can pick up herself and use for a cause that she believes in. So this, I think, is a big part of the problem, that many of us have held back. Even if our beliefs were right, our actions were lacking, and we've played a kind of helpless position that is no longer, that wasn't sustainable then and certainly isn't sustainable now. And then finally, the Ten of Pentacles, which in like the context of a general reading, this is a really wonderful card. It's a card of abundance. It's a card of intergenerational comfort, or the creation of a community that is nicely resourced. It doesn't have to be within a blood family, but it can be. The pentacles in this card are also configured in the shape of the tree of life from the Kabbalah. But in this context, this card leaps out to me as one of the kind of the material privilege that many white people in America get to enjoy. Inherited wealth, yes, as Eliza is saying. So because of that history that I spoke of, the colonization of land, the mistreatment of people and bodies and communities in order to build a capitalist system that white families have been benefiting from for generations and passing on to one another, you get to this place of really great comfort and luxury. And this is what we're taught to aspire to. And we're taught to believe that this is what we want and what we should want, and that it's perfectly great. And once people are in such a comfortable position, all of these other things, the Eight of Swords mentality, the Five of Swords mentality, will pop up to protect that wealth, or to keep it where someone feels that it belongs. And it also creates a greater sense of complacency. If you're doing fine, and if you live in this bubble and you have all the resources you need, why would you be thinking about what others need? That's not the way every wealthy person feels. That's not the way all white people think, but it's certainly the distribution of wealth as a result of this issue and others is one that prevents us from talking about it and thinking about really capitalism is another engine of this whole thing. And it would mean something very different for people with inherited wealth to kind of think about capitalism in a different way. So this is another method of reinforcement. And I will say that, talking about this cards in this context, this isn't to say that anytime you ever do a reading for someone and you see one of these cards, it's a signal to this particular context, but this is another way of understanding how these cards can operate in different readings. So I'll show you the versions of those cards from the Next World Tarot. You can see the Three of Swords there with a more anatomically correct looking heart that's quite battered and bruised and even unhealthy. There look to be some clogged arteries. And we certainly know, you could take that all the way to the healthcare system in the United States, which in communities of color, social determinants of health are much different than they are in white communities. It's harder to find healthcare and healthy living. In the Five of Swords, this notion, I really like this interpretation of survival. So that was the card where the man had stolen 3 swords and there were 2 lying on the ground. And you could view that approach to doing business as one of survival, and many people do. And this card is using that theme in this way, but there's this kind of like the microscope that they're holding is an indication of like curiosity. And there's also this growth of the plant coming from the bulb that they're holding. And so I really think this is a different way of, like, instead of the thievery that we see in the other card, this is a card more of study and using the intellect to know. And they're actually, Farah said, are there any swords in this version of the card? And we don't really see them. I think we could only maybe look at the towers, the smokestacks in the back as swords. Like they may be the source of theft in one sense. And here's the figure who's coming in to kind of try and rescue the climate, rescue the planet through the study of plants and this one living plant that maybe can be harvested to rebuild the world. And then the other 2, we have the 8 of Swords here. I think that says restriction. And the 10 of Pentacles, which offers us a different depiction of abundance. And here the word is security. And it's this freedom to walk a tightrope, to feel balanced, to feel the figure is surrounded by the different phases of the moon and appears to be walking over a community that looks kind of nestled in for the night, one that looks healthy. So now we'll talk about this shift and these 3 cards of like the turning point. And the Wheel of Fortune is a card about how the cosmic winds shift. We can, as human beings, do so many things to try and control our environment, to control our lives, to set them on a particular path. But we are still limited. Our control is very, very finite. And we are navigating a world that has much larger mechanisms at work than the ones that we create. And that's even beyond the systems that are human made. So the pandemic is a naturally occurring phenomenon, though it has been facilitated by all of our different human lifestyle choices. But it seemed to come out of nowhere. We don't have an explanation for the timing of this. Why now? So we're moving through, and I think, because of the timeline, the tarot timeline I showed you at the beginning, this chain of events, this turn of events has set us through this collective experience of the moon, the hermit, the death card, and now I feel like all of those things prepared us to confront the devil moment in a way that I hope is more meaningful and lasting and sustainable. And then you also have the Hanged Man, who is not being tortured, who is not being sacrificed, but well, he sort of sacrificed himself. He has elected to climb up on this branch and suspend himself upside down. If you turn this card the other way, he kind of looks like a dancer, like he's in a pose like a dancer, and then his head is illuminated with light, and almost as if he's coming to some greater enlightenment. And so this card is really about shifting perspective. Similar to the Hermit, he's removed himself from the rest of the world that walks right side up, but he's kind of taken it on a different track by physically turning himself 180 degrees opposite his normal vantage point. So from here, he can see the world in a different way than everyone else can. And I think, or I hope for a lot of us, this is happening. You know, I've been talking a little bit about new levels of awareness that are coming through for me. And I know that more are coming. But this is a time when we need to be open and receptive to the possibility of having our perception and our understanding of the world changed. And then we have the Justice card, which is about coming to terms with what we value, what we stand for, what is meaningful for us, and then not stopping there, but taking action as a result of those beliefs and that value system. So actually, the Hermit card is number 9 in the major arcana. Then comes the Wheel of Fortune, number 10. And then comes the Justice card, number 11. So they're out of place here, but this is just how I wanted to present them. But you can think about the Hermit card kind of prepares you in the story of the major arcana for the shift of the Wheel of Fortune. There's been all of this like inner study that's happened in the Hermit, and then the world changes through the Wheel of Fortune. And because of the Hermit work, we're now prepared to really think about what we value and what's meaningful and what's important to us from an inner standpoint. We've been like doing that workout, that practice with the Hermit. And now it's about taking what exists within us as a belief system and carrying it forward into the world beyond us. And that's what Justice is about. Naomi says, I've been meditating a lot on justice, and I like how justice is simply looking to create balance, not to judge and not for revenge. Yeah, I think that's important. This is not like in our artistic representations of what justice is, like in a statue of justice in America, justice is blindfolded. But this justice figure can see everything very clearly, and the scales are balanced. So it's looking for harmony. Yeah, definitely in line with abolition work for sure. So we were talking about, or I was talking about the gross distribution of wealth, the uneven distribution of wealth in our country, and how different communities are resourced for the benefit of some and the detriment of others. So justice would come in to rebalance that, not in a punitive way, but in a way to create harmony and equality, which is what this country is supposed to stand for. So those are the cards that I think are kind of helping us turn from one to the other. Yeah, 10 of Pentacles, which we talked about in the condition line. Eliza is saying 10 of Pentacles turning toward justice. If you kind of channel it in through the Justice card, that would look like reparations. And that's another issue around which I've become like way more invested. It's something that, like 10 years ago I was in favor of, but I didn't know how to like say that. And now I'm very clearly able to be like, yes, we need this. This is part of the healing process. Here's a look at the cards from the Next World Tarot deck. So you see Wheel of Fortune kind of surrounded by this detritus of human civilization, all of it like spinning in this swirl, and something I'm really interested in this satchel that they're holding. I don't know. I want to know what's in there. But the thing about the Wheel of Fortune is that we don't really get to know which way it's turning. We just have to know it's turning, pay attention, and try to join our energy with its movement in the way that honors our own purpose and how we can serve something beyond ourselves. With the suspension card, that's the Hanged Man in the middle, called Suspension here. It's much more, it's a very it's kind of like an artful dance. And it even more so reinforces this idea that the Hanged Man has chosen to place themselves up there to look down on things and really have a much higher level view of the world that we normally just kind of participate in, walk around and go about our business in. And then in the Justice card, this looks like a scene we've seen recently on the news almost, the sign that says "Stop killing us," and this really diverse crowd of people fighting for freedom, equality, dignity, all of these things. And so you can see that justice, as we talked about with the other card, here you can see it in action, isn't just this figure sitting there evaluating. It's taking those values out into the streets among the people, speaking up, showing up. And that's a big part of this too. All right, so now we're on our last line, which is about the work required, which is far more extensive than this, but a place to start. And the first card I have here is the Ace of Cups. And the Ace of Cups is about love. The cups are about the heart space. So where we saw several swords cards up in the problem line, we see a few more cups down here in the medicine line, how we can work to remake the world. So a big part of that is love, and the cups are about emotions. The Ace of Cups is this opening salvo of emotion. It's like the heart coming alive again. Sometimes I tell people it's like, if you live in Austin, it's like jumping into Barton Springs on a August day. Barton Springs is 60 something degrees. It's very cold. It gets really hot here in the summer, of course, in Texas. And so it's like being reborn when you jump in that water. And the Ace of Cups is sort of like a rebirth for the heart, feeling the sense of renewal, this sense of abiding love, viewing the world around you through that lens of love rather than cynicism or skepticism. But I want to emphasize that love is an action and not merely a feeling. So as we've, part of the grief that we saw in the death card when I talked about that timeline, that's the loss of things that we love. And so that's very difficult to lose what we love. But love is an endless resource. We can create it, and it isn't just a feeling we have, it's how we show love to other people. So as we've watched, I watch Rachel Maddow every night at 8 p.m. She is the best journalist, I think, in the whole world. I absolutely love her. It's a hard hour of news every day, really hard to sit through because there's some really terrible shit going on in the world. And a lot of the pain that I feel comes from love for people. I don't want nurses to be suffering and treated this way as they're trying to treat people in a pandemic. I don't want thousands of people to have to go out in the streets during a pandemic to demand what they should have already been given forever ago. So how can I take that sense of love and turn it into something meaningful that contributes to, like I said, to the solution, to the change? So our next card is the Six of Cups. And I feel like this card is when people want to cast aspersions or doubts upon the idea of defunding the police. I feel like defund the police really means what this card is actually talking about. Instead of pouring our resources into heavily armed, often violent, state-funded entities that are apparently willing to harm people for no reason whatsoever, at a magnitude that is appalling. What if we use that money to invest in our communities in a different way? If we invested that money in schools, if we had more social workers instead of police officers, what if those social workers were paid like a police officer's salary? What if we had so much more money invested in mental health care and healthcare, and we had different models for capitalism instead of like everyone trying to have all of the same business and make the most money at that business? What if they joined forces to create something that served a lot of people and made it really accessible? So we live in a world where it's sort of this individual competition all the time. And this, I think, the Six of Cups, the sweetness of this card, you can see the two figures who are child figures exchanging this pot with a beautiful white flower. You can't really tell who's giving and who's receiving. I see now that even the fact that the flower is white is problematic. And I'll show you another version of this card in just a second. But there's not this idea of like taking and owning, but sharing and creating a safe that looks warm. Creating a space that looks safe and warm and inviting for everyone who lives there. Then we have the Queen of Swords, and she, back to the swords, which are the mind, the intellect. She is the boundary keeper. She is the gatekeeper. You can see that she's welcoming with one hand and holding her sword up high with the other, the same way that Justice holds their sword, actually. But we're just getting a side view here. So people are welcome to approach this queen, but she'll be letting you know what her boundaries are. And whether or not you want to honor those boundaries will determine whether or not you may enter. And so I think you'll see this in a second, but this card comes right below the Eight of Swords, which was that card of white fragility, white silence, feeling helpless. This is that figure, that woman transformed into someone who understands the privilege, the power that she possesses, and has gone through that process of Wheel of Fortune, the Justice card, the Hanged Man card of changed perspective. And here she knows herself really well. She knows her power. She knows how to hold a sword. And she's already defined for herself what her limits are. So this can happen in a small way where it's like, I make a promise to myself that if I hear a comment in a meeting at work that is dismissive of an employee of color, or that is dismissive of the work of anti-racism or something along those lines, I've made a promise to myself to speak up and to not let it go by unheard, unnoticed, not called out. So that's boundary work. That's where you know yourself and you know what your limits are, so that when these things come up, you feel prepared. You're not caught off guard. This becomes tricky because for a lot of us, we have family members who have beliefs that are much more problematic and than our own. And so how do we deal with relatives that we're related to by blood, but who really do not live up to our sense of justice or boundaries? And that's where the Five of Swords comes in. So, Five of Wands. It's the Five of Wands. And our first Wands card. The Wands represent fire, and they represent the life force within us. So like the spark that animates the body. The Wands are associated with adventure, sensuality, physical movement, things like dance, performance, all that stuff. So the fives are always kind of conflict laden, and here you see a little conflict happening. Interestingly, all of the figures in this card are wearing kind of festive clothing. They're not dressed for battle. If they really wanted to kill each other, maybe they would use swords, but the wands are a little safer. And this is a card about becoming more comfortable with your own engagement in conflict. So I grew up an only child of divorced parents and like a latchkey kid. So I didn't really have anyone to teach me about conflict. And I learned early that conflict meant maybe my parents, like people's relationships will fall apart. So I spent a lot of my life being very conflict averse. Thanks to a lot of therapy and other things, that has changed. But I've learned through contrast that the ability to show up for conflict is really a game changer. Conflict will not kill us, usually. Most often it will not, especially when we know we're in a pretty safe environment and we know that we need to kind of fight with our words. And that really just means like the Queen of Swords, let's say, she's asserting a new boundary. She's telling her family member, like, she's not going to put up with that kind of comment or statement around her or around her children or whatever that may be. This is a new boundary she's established. No one in her family has heard her say this before. And they're like, what are you talking about? Who are you? Where did this come from? There's going to be some kind of backlash. There's going to be some kind of reaction. It's probably negative. And things get a little heated. And that's what the Five of Wands is. It's the willingness to assert your boundary, face whatever unfortunate reaction the other person has, and feel firm in the boundary that you've established. So that might be a tense moment. You might walk away from that encounter feeling bad in one sense that you watched your family members behave in this way, but good, on the other hand, knowing that you've done the work of understanding what your values are, what your boundaries are, and you showed up to draw that line. You may find over time, so every time this happens, the Queen of Swords gets stronger. The Five of Swords, and it's just more Five of Swords practice. Your ability to handle conflict becomes greater and greater and greater. Each time it rolls off your back a little bit easier because you've been preparing yourself with this to be uncomfortable in this process. And you may find that while, the first time this happens, things kind of fall apart. Gradually, over a longer period of time, the thing that you said and the way that you showed up for yourself and the way that you exerted a boundary may prove to have an effect down the road that you can't see in the immediate sense. So the process is more important than the immediate outcome, because if you know your values and know your beliefs, and you did a lot of work to figure out what they are, but if you won't step up for them, if you won't be uncomfortable in order to back those beliefs up, what was the work for, right? So that's why I think Five of Wands is really important here. So here's what these cards look like in the Next World Tarot deck. You see the Ace of Cups as this like lotus blossom blooming in a more apocalyptic looking background, but the sense of like purifying and renewing and bringing like cooling love to a space of destruction. And then you have the Six of Cups, which was that card of the children exchanging flowers. And here you see this, the word reunion is offered, the sense of community, healthy community, having intergenerational wisdom and love passed between one another to create that community. I even like there's two ladybugs down below. And then you have the Queen of Swords, which is called the Throne of Truth. And she's standing there ready to face whatever's coming. And then I think this Five of Wands interpretation is really interesting as well, where, the word strife, I think, is important. And she's, or they're there with these broken plants. Something has been lost. Something has been broken a little bit, but the whole place hasn't been torn down. She's connecting with her heart. She's going within herself. She's ready to kind of make her own peace with whatever has happened here and rebuild in the way that she needs to. So this confrontation with like some brokenness or loss or some difficulty, some discomfort, but a kind of strength within that strife. And I did want to add the Ace of Wands. I was a little bit on the fence about Ace of Cups or Ace of Wands, but I wanted to talk about it no matter what. So we talked about the wands being the life force, and the ace, just like with the Ace of Cups, it's this opening salvo, this beginning of wands energy. And of course, wands in a magical context, the wand is used to direct energy from the spirit realm, from the cosmos, and channel it into the physical realm to create change, to manifest something. So the wands are about action and movement. Love does have more of that like feeling connotation to it, but the wands and the fire are really about action, 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 action. What can you do? What can you manifest? Where can you direct your energy in a way that's meaningful? So keep that in mind as part of this equation as well. Let's see. So if you just compare these two top and bottom lines real quick, you see like the pain in the Three of Swords could find some relief in the outpouring of love that we see in the Ace of Cups. But again, what does love look like as an action? In South Africa, for example, that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and that process, which again was not perfect, but nevertheless far more than we've seen in America. The love that we feel or want to provide to create healing must follow with accountability, responsibility, truthfulness, taking ownership of what has happened in order to heal the wound that was created and that has persisted for so long. In our second pair of cards, we see on top the figure who wants to keep for himself and hoard the swords, take them all for his own and leave everyone with nothing. And contrary to that, we have the Six of Cups, which is about sharing the resources that are available and making them go as far as possible for as many people as possible. We talked about this a little bit already with the Eight of Swords and the Queen of Swords. I see the Queen of Swords as the opportunity to transform this helpless, like self-victimized person in the Eight of Swords and bring her into a place of power, self-possession, and like strong communication skills are a big part of that too. And then we had the Ten of Pentacles up top. And if we were to begin a process of reparations and take concentrations of wealth where they are most heavily concentrated and start to redistribute them into places where they're most needed to create something like we see in the Six of Cups, this will create certainly a great deal of friction, but one that could be incredibly powerful and productive and leave everyone in a place where they're able to flourish, not having lost anything. But the lie, the illusion of white supremacy and of capitalism is that like certain people are entitled to that, and that's where the capital and the money should remain. And confronting that illusion is going to create something like what we see in the Five of Wands, and probably something even more intense. But you can see how it's interesting to kind of contrast cards. And it's not as if like Three of Swords and Ace of Cups are always going to belong together, or that if you think of Ace of Cups, you have to think of Three of Swords. I'm not saying that at all, but rather these are cards that I found helpful in kind of constructing a story as I'm coming to learn more about it and as I've studied it over time, to kind of show some of the different elements here. I would like you to choose one card to work with from this entire spread. So as I was talking about these cards, think about which of them seemed most like where your body started to vibrate when you started to think, yes, this is me. You're like, oh, yeah, I totally want to get to know this card better. Choose one that seems to resonate with you for whatever reason and pull it out of your deck. It's going to be kind of the crowning card of a short reading that we'll do. And then take the rest of your cards and shuffle them together. I'm going to show you a little reading we'll try together. So you've selected one of the cards, Five of Wands, Queen of Swords, the Hangman. Keep that card kind of up top, and then you're going to choose 3 different cards. And for each one, as you pull that card, many of you probably have your own tarot practice, in which case you don't need to take any advice from me. But if you're newer to tarot, just kind of focus on one question at a time. Hold that question in your mind. Choose your card and turn it over. And then move on to your next card. And let's see, it's 7:45 right now. So I'm going to go until 7:55. I'm going to give you all about 10 minutes to pull cards. And then I would encourage you to write a little bit about each one. So the first question is, what do I need to see about my relationship to this card? So that refers to whatever card you've selected. So maybe you'll see a reluctancy, maybe you'll see an adventurousness, maybe you'll see a little bit of fear, maybe you'll see a little bit of pain. But we'll ask the tarot what we need to see about that card, or that your relationship with it. The second question is, how can I work with this energy in a meaningful way? So the Queen of Wands, Queen of Swords, Five of Wands, this question will be asking, like, maybe providing some insight into how you can conceive of working with this energy, what you can do with it. And then finally, what do I need to remember as I work with this energy? And I suspect you may find something about yourself that you are being told to remember, maybe about your strength, maybe again about your fears, maybe about your pain. But see one comes up, take a few notes as you go.